So, so those of you having juice coming in, especially the Viognier, here's a couple of topics that might help you, or other whites. First thing is keep the juice cool when you get it. It will be, I don't know how cool it's going to be when we get it, but keep it cool while you're fermenting. Test the pH. I always like to start with a pH of about 3.4, somewhere around in there. If it's not acidic enough, like the last batch, I added some tartaric acid to bring that pH down. I have a Vinmetrica to test pH, but there's other methods out there. I test the sugar level to make sure that I have the correct amount of alcohol at the final product. So anywhere from about 1085, maybe 1090 is where I'm going for on a hydrometer. And then I add a couple extra things to help that fermentation. I like to add FT Blanc soft. Also Opti White. A pectic enzyme would also work. That's helped to clear it down the road. And also a bentonite. Bentonite also helps to settle the lees. There's either bentonite or George hooked me up with this KWC. Is that even available anymore? I looked it up and I couldn't find it. Okay. Oh, maybe I got it spelled wrong. Maybe that's why I couldn't find it. All right, let me fix that here. KWK. All right. So, okay, I'll talk about that a little bit at the end in the results. All right. So a little more with the ingredients. I start my yeast with GoFirm Protect, and that helps to make the yeast much more viable. And I use QA23 for the last batch that I used. I like that because it holds a lot of the aromas in wine. So I pitch the yeast. That doesn't mean I throw it out. That means that it actually gets added to the juice. And that's transferred to a carboy. I didn't do this until maybe 4 years ago to ferment white wines in a carboy. But what it does is it locks in a lot of the aromas of the wine and makes it, you get much better aromas from it. You just have to stir it occasionally to give it a little bit of oxygen at the beginning of the fermentation. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah.
What temperature are you fermenting the wet jack?
It's my perfect basement temperature. All right. So my basement at this time of year is about 68 to 70 degrees. I'd love to have it about 65, maybe even 60, but that's the way it is. I'm not going to try to refrigerate it. But if I wanted to ferment it cooler, I could put some ice packs on the outside of those carboys. So, and that drops the temperature. Thank you for bringing that up to me. All right. Once the fermentation is rolling, that means I see a lot of bubbles happening. I'll put in half of the nutrient. So I usually use Fermade O or Fermade K, and then I stir it daily. And then about 1/3 of the drop in sugar, based on a hydrometer, when it gets about 1060, then I'll put in the other half of the nutrient. All right, and then once it's down to about 1.000, or it's still bubbling a little bit, then I will rack it off the lees, get it off the lees, because I don't think it helps white wines to be sitting on the lees too long. And then in a couple of weeks, I'll ferment it, or I'll rack it again. So once I rack it off the lees, now I can actually bring the carboys up to full instead of having this gap. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I'll stabilize it with potassium sorbate, or you could filter it. I don't have a filter, so I use potassium sorbate to stabilize it if I think that it's a little unbalanced and it could use a little bit of back sweetening for balance. And the person that I go to every time is Becky. She's got a great taste. She knows. She's outstanding for saying, you need a little more sugar in this. So we sweeten it to what we like. We don't like sweet wines, but we like to have a balanced wine. And then, of course, we do add metabisulfite to make sure that we have it stabilized. So So again, we can either clarify it or we can filter it. We also use, when we balance it, we use a bench trial. I've got these cute little beakers from American Science and Surplus. They're 50 millimeter beakers. Fill it with 40 millimeters of liquid, and in the first one, I'll put in, if I'm doing sugar, this isn't viognier, obviously, but half a mil or 1.5 or 2 mils of sugar with a pipette. And what that does is it gives us a good range of where the sugar level is. It tastes good. So if you're not sure how a bench trial works, that's what it is. Really easy. And then from that, then I can do the math and then extrapolate how much sugar to put in the whole carb. Okay? And if it needs a little bit of acid, I'll use some tartaric acid and add that in. All right. So when I did the last batch of the Viognier, since I had two different primaries, I used two different bentonites. So I used a regular bentonite, the Albumex, in the one on the left, and I used the KWK on the right. And the difference is that there's very little foaming. So if you're kind of close to the top of your carboy, you don't have to worry about it all coming through the airlock, which really makes a mess and it kind of annoys you because it's stinky mess, and then you get fruit flies and everything else. So anyway, the final specific gravity of this became 1.002, so just beyond off dry, and then the alcohol ended up being 12. So that's the juice that we used last time, or the juice that we got from the last order. So if you have juice coming for this coming order coming up late September, hopefully this may help with your wine. Okay, any questions? All right, how'd I do?
Did you win a best in show?
Oh, okay, just a minute. And I was fortunate that Becky and I got a best of show in this because I did the winemaking, but it's really Becky does it's really the quality control, right. The balance, I can't stress balance enough, because that really makes your wine, if you like it, most people, I think other people will like it as well, okay? Yes, thank you. And later today, I'm thinking, I forgot to put cold stabilization. So that's where you take your white wine or fruit wine or red or whatever, something that, especially if it's high in acid, put it in the garage where it's super cold during winter. It can get down to 25. Warning: don't use water in your airlock; it'll freeze. So put in vodka. But anyway, all the crystals, its tartaric crystals, drop out. And so now when you refrigerate your bottle, you don't have the glass in the bottom of the bottle. So thanks for bringing that up. I do cold stabilize, but I use my garage. Yes, absolutely. Anytime you add sugar to your wine that's not stabilized, the yeast comes alive and starts bubbling up. Stabilize it first, then you backsweet. And I do it in the same day, the same hour. Right? Do I do any wine conditioners? No, I don't know enough about this. Glycerin instead of sugar. I thought about that as a way to backsweeten it without needing a stabilizer by using glycerin. But I haven't experimented. Anybody else? George?
You did bring up rehydrating your yeast. There is a new product by Scott Labs. Instead of using Go-Firm to do your rehydration, I don't know, almost all of you have done that. And it's kind of a pain in the neck because you start out with 110-degree water, you add the Go-Firm, and then you wait till it gets down to 104 degrees, then you add your yeast. You look at the yeast until it gets down to about 80, 85 degrees, and then you can pitch it, which all takes a lot of time and a lot of temperature. The new product is called, and some of you guys have used it. I know, I'm pretty sure Mike has used it last year, called Flash, Go Firm Flat, Sterile Flash or something like that. And did you use some, Chuck, too? 60 degree water, put the yeast in, wait 15 minutes, and that's it. Pitch it. So I think it might be, the only place you can get it is Scott Lab, so you may want to buy some for the club and divvy it up. Michael.
I find that you have to mix it forever to really get it fully in suspension. The sterile flash is instantaneous, and I just bought some. You can go to more winemaking, and I think I get them in like 12 or 18 gram packets. So you don't have to end up buying $100 worth or something like that.
And to be honest with you, I use Go Firm, and I don't pay attention to the temperature. It's kind of warm. You mix it up. It's good enough. It's like, oh, that's not too warm. Throw the yeast. So I'm not too particular. It works.
My new hero in the whole club is Mark Crum now. He has some juice buckets, and he said, George, would you test my juice and give it an evaluation, which we did, 4 of them. And I said, Mark, what's your protocol? I just dump the yeast on top and let it sit. So Mary and I did the judging, and Mary said, why are you doing all this screwing around? Use Mark's method. It does work, yeah.
Okay, the other comment I want to make is for my white wines, I typically let it sit on the lees a long time. I mean, I've gone a couple of months, I've gone 3 months, because I think it does help. And after I'm done racking, I smell those lees, and they're just as clean smelling as you could believe. So there's a little difference in the technique I use.
Getting all the experts in here. Quite a few years ago now, I got the tip from Howard Hasselquist, who very fine white wines for our club, and also added sugar with fructose. And he said, I lost my memory on this, either the dissolve or last, and I can't remember why he felt it was better than table sugar, but I always went up to the health food store on 108th Street that he told me to go to, and I used fructose. If anybody wants to try it or has maybe tried it, that's what I always use for sugar.
All right. One more thing?
One more thing. You know, as far as back sweetening, I've had more wines start re-fermenting on me than I would care to admit. So I've been following this Pombiachi's protocol, and honestly, what he says in there is you sulfite and then wait a day or two. You put in your sorbate. You wait 2 weeks. Then you put in your sugar. You wait 2 weeks before bottling. Now, to me, that was stretching it a little bit. I was under some time pressure, but I did wait like 10 days, and it's working pretty good right now.
You have another question?
I've heard in the past from some other guys that I know they would actually stabilize fruit juice and put a little of that back in the vaccine and add and that kind of stuff. Maybe you recommend that he tried it, had success, failure.
If you got juice, say in a bucket, you can stabilize it, make sure it's sanitized, freeze it, or keep it really cold. And then when you're ready to do the bench trial, use that instead of sugar. Now, remember that you're probably going to use a bigger volume because the sugar solution is a 2 to 1, 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. So your alcohol is going to decrease. So you can calculate the change in alcohol if that's important. Or you can bring your alcohol back up a bit if you wanted with Everclear's. All right? Jim?
In the juices that we get are I always back sweeten with, I take off a half a gallon religiously of whatever juice I get. And I ferment everything else. I add a little bit of potassium metabisulfite to it and a little stabilizer to it. But when you look at the math for table sugar of 4 ounces raises 1 gallon 1 point, when you're talking about 1090 to whatever the next one would be a 1,000. You're looking at somewhere around 1.5 pounds of cane sugar in a gallon of wine juice, a veritable. That's a lot of sugar. And that's what I watch at. And if I have some people that come around and families, I've started doing juices out of our backyard and some of the juices that we get through the buckets. And I tell at like Thanksgiving or Christmas, there's a lot of sugar in there. So you're drinking pure Merlot juice or you're drinking pure cab juice, whatever. So there's a lot of sugar in there, and I give them the math. And there's, whoa, okay. So there's a lot of sugar in a veritable.
All right, I think we're going to pause the questions right now so that we can get Steve up here. But I want everybody to stand up. Everybody stand up. Turn around 2 or 3 times because we've been sitting for a while, right? So, all right. So I'm going to get the PowerPoint ready for Steve. All right, that should do it. Thanks, Becky. Everybody clink their glasses. Let's get Steve rolling with his program here. He said he doesn't have more than an hour and a half. All right. And, have you welcome Steve. Francois, talk.
A few years ago, I was pressing some of my red wine, and I happened to look down at. I was sitting, in front of my grape press. I looked down, and here's what I saw. I saw this heart. It was a grape skin that it was in the shape of a heart. I thought, well, that really kind of describes all of us here and our love of wine and winemaking. And there it was. Okay, so I want to talk about, and actually, there have been a lot of comments and have actually sort of addressed some of the comments I was going to have on some of my slides. And actually, George's comment about the thing to replace GoFirm, and so I'll buzz by some of the stuff that I have here. Okay, so I just wanted to briefly just mention the structure of a grape compared to a regular eating grape. They're smaller, and for red grapes, the skin has the color, the pigments of the red wine, and it also has tannin in it. And then you have the pulp, which is almost always clear, except for like an Alicante Boucher, which has red pulp. And there's some other
indigenous grapes around the world that also have a red pulp, but the pulp gives us the juice, and inside of the pulp are the seeds, which also can provide red wine with tannins, and tannins are very important for red wine. Now, in the Midwest, we have all of these wonderful cold hardy grapes, mostly from the Vitis Riparia, Pearl, Frontenac, Marshall Foch, Crimson Pearl, Verona. I was talking with Charles recently, or tonight, and he said that he's going to be harvesting his Petite Pearl, and he was talking about the sugar levels in his Petite Pearl. I can never get my sugar levels up as high as he does. He's got much better sun exposure than I do. So often with some of the cold hardy grapes in the Midwest, the grapes don't reach their full ripeness, and so they're similar to other grapes around the world over the centuries, where winemakers have been challenged by grapes that are not completely ripe. And so, what do you do with that? Well, there's a technique that has been developed over the centuries, and it's called appassamento. Using the appassamento process, or making what's called straw wine. Now, it's not making red wine from straw, but it's getting your red grapes that are not completely ripe, and then putting it into an attic on straw and leaving them there for a period of sometimes 2 to 3 months to let them raisin and lose maybe 40% of their volume, and it concentrates. Now, about 10 years ago, and then I was looking at the Marquette grapes I had in my backyard, and was with this problem that I had, and so I decided I was going to try this method. And I experimented with it, and I also got juice from Prairie Home Vintners in the fall that said it had, in this one, it was red juice, they called it Amarone juice. Well, it's not really Amarone juice, because Amarone wine goes through this process of putting the grapes and having them raisinette over the course of time. But I decided I was going to buy some of these juice buckets, 3 of them, and then buy Cabernet Sauvignon grapes from California, and then putting them in my attic to go through this process. I ended up being very pleased with the wine, wrote an article for first the Vintners Press here, and then I sent it into Winemaking Magazine, and it was in the December 2016, January 2017 issue. Those are my grapes up in my attic after about 3 weeks of drying out. Now, here we have this next slide. Okay, the next slide. These are Petite Pearl grapes that I did the same appassamento process on. This is when I first started it, and it's on old window screens on crates in my attic, my garage attic, and then after about 2.5 weeks, this is what the grapes look like. And what it does is it brings up the sugar levels, it increases the flavor profile of the grape, and the seeds they're not green and vegetative anymore. So it adds quality to it. So this is a brief description of that appassamento process.
I wonder if you could do some of that in a frost-free refrigerator or freezer to pull that moisture out.
Oh. I think what that would do is it would pull out it probably would pull out the water. It would concentrate the sugars. No, it wouldn't age the seeds. I've never heard of anybody doing that. It's probably it might be one reason why nobody's tried that is that it's, back in the centuries, they didn't have refrigerators. And so this is a much easier process. And the passamento process is probably much more effective. It wouldn't do what Randy suggested, is it wouldn't really do much with the seeds. Yes, and when you do lay your clusters on, they can't be touching one another. So you've got to have a lot of space between the clusters of the grape. Okay, now that's just a brief version of it. You can go back to this article or the Vintners Press to read more about it. But I want to talk about the red winemaking process. Okay, so here's Mike. I think that's Mike Cesar's right there at the crush, and in most cases, you separate the stems from the red grapes right away because the stems have tannins in it, and these are kind of vegetative green tannins that really don't provide much good flavor to our wine. So you pull them off, and you're using a crusher and destemmer, very similar to the ones that we use for our group crushes. Pulls the stems off, shoots them out, and then the crushed grapes come down into a bucket, and then everybody gets their buckets, however much they ordered, and they bring them back to their house. So now what do? This is a fermentation process. Okay, we talked about that. I don't have to really mention that much. But basically it's just the yeast consumes the sugars in the must and then poops out the alcohol and the carbon dioxide. That's winemaking. It's you're drinking the yeast poop. Okay. Now before adding the yeast, there are some steps to complete, and this is where I'm going to pass through some of these. So first, you measure the sulfite level when you first get your must to see what's in there. Sometimes the grape growers will spray the grapes that are in the refrigerator trucks with sulfite before they get there. So it might be that you have more than enough sulfite to protect the grapes. And the reason why you might want to add sulfite is that over that 24-hour period that it's sitting there, and before the yeast starts to consume the commercial yeast, there's wild yeast that is on the grapes that come from the vineyard, and maybe you don't want those because they're kind of chancy. There could be yeast not only from the vineyard, but it could be yeast from the processing plant, from anything else that you have. And so a lot of winemakers follow the process of adding some sulfite to raise the sulfite levels to stun the wild yeast. And then the next day you add the commercial yeast that then takes over and starts to consume the sugars and doesn't allow the wild yeast to really gain any kind of ground in your must. Now, often I don't do that. I don't add the sulfite because I'm wondering about whether or not there's sulfite already there that'll be okay. But also, I'm also in almost every single case of red wine, I want to go through malolactic fermentation. I want to add some malolactic bacteria within about 24 hours. And malolactic bacteria doesn't like sulfite. So I often don't do that. But also another reason why I have not done it is I think that there might be something that the wild yeast might add early on in the process to give a little bit different flavor. Again, it's a risk because the thing that it might add might be very unpleasant. But so far in the years that I've done this, I haven't had any problems with funky red wine. So again, I don't know if it's really if the wild yeast is adding anything, but sometimes I don't do that. I also will add some color pro enzyme to increase the yield, the color, and the tannin extraction. And again, this is before the yeast is added. Also up in red, soften and round out the tannins. And then I measure the pH level of the must. And this is usually like later in the evening of the day that I have the grapes crushed, and I use the pH meter, and if the pH level is like 3.9 or 3.8, meaning there's almost always there's low acid. Yeah, Mark. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. I'll tell you about that in a second. I'm not adding the malolactic bacteria before I add the yeast. So I measure the pH, and then and then I'll add some tartaric acid to raise the acid level and lower the pH level if the pH level is too high. I want to be at about 3.6 for the beginning of fermentation for the pH level. Now, that's usually the first day, and then I go to sleep. I also measure the sugar level, the hydrometer or refractometer. And in some cases, if the sugar level is too high, that means the wine is going to be, maybe 16% alcohol at the end, which is hot. It's a hot wine. So you might want to add some acidulated sugar or water then, bring down the sugar level. Or pearl and some of the hybrid grapes, it might be a lower sugar level, so you might have to add cane sugar to raise up the sugar level of the must. Yeah, Mike? If the sugar level in a red wine is 3.3, and that can happen with our cold climate grapes, I might add some potassium carbonate to it. It's like baking soda that will take out the acid, take out some of the acid, but you have to be careful with that. And if you do that, you definitely have to cold stabilize your red wine prior to bottling, because you're going to get a lot of crystals at the bottom. But that's months later. 3.6, 3.65. I don't want to be much above 3.65 when I'm, before I'm starting fermentation, because then I might also be measuring acid, but I usually rely upon fellow winemakers in the club to measure the acid. I measure the pH. George will then send out an email from the grapes we got and tell me what the acid level was. And so I'm kind of lazy in that regard. Again, on the first day, then I will add FD Rouge, and now I'm my must to bed for the night. The next day, this is where we get to the discussion we had earlier. I'll rehydrate the commercial yeast. Okay, use Go Firm Protect Evolution, and then doing this 110 degree thing, then wait till it's at 104, then add the rehydrated solution, and do all this stuff. But now there's a new way you can do it, and it's Scott Labs, so I might try that out. Now, what I often do is sometimes fellow winemakers will wait until the end of fermentation, till the end of primary fermentation, to add the malolactic bacteria. I used to do that. Now I'm adding the malolactic bacteria within 12 to 24 hours after I add the yeast. So the yeast is just establishing itself, and then I add the malolactic bacteria, and they're doing different types of fermentation at the same time. And I've read a lot about this, and it seems like that's a process that a lot of winemakers are doing. So I decided to do it to see how it works. And I like the fact that I want to finish my malolactic fermentation as soon as possible, because I don't want to add any sulfite before the end of malolactic fermentation, but sulfite is what preserves and protects your wine. I want to have that process starting as soon as possible. Yeah. Well, you want early on in primary fermentation, you actually do want to have a lot of oxidation. You want to have a lot of oxygen exposure that helps the fermentation process. mean, it can go on for a couple months, and then you're thinking, okay, well, what am I? You know, I haven't protected my wine, and even though you have it under airlock, yeah, that could be an issue. Yeah. Now, once fermentation starts, you've got to punch down your cap. This is something that with white winemaking you don't have to worry about because the skins aren't in contact. So this is my glass of my wine on top of the must as it's fermenting. That's the cap. It's solid enough where I can do that. I can just lay that on there, and it forms this solid cap. And if you don't punch it down and push those skins down into the fermenting juice, you're going to have, as it dries out, you're going to have bacteria forming, and you're going to ruin your wine. The reason why the cap goes up like that is because as the yeast is doing its consumption of the sugar and pooping out the carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide is very light and it's pushing those skins up to the top and forming that cap. So you need workers to help you with this process. And so I've enlisted one of my neighbors many years ago to do this, and now I've got a 3-year-old grandson, so I can have him come and help me with that. Just punch it down. And you do this 3 times a day at the beginning when the fermentation is really going strong. And then after about 7 days or so, you only have to do this maybe once or twice a day. Because the cap, at a certain point, the cap collapses because the carbon dioxide is not coming up like it was before, and thus the cap doesn't really come up to the top. Okay, at 1/3 sugar depletion, you add fermento to the water, and then you press. I usually press it when my specific gravity is at 1.00 or the Brix is at 0. Sometimes I'll go a little bit lower than that, have a little bit more consumption, and it varies when you want to do the pressing too, based on how much tannin you want in your wine and how deep of a color you want in your red wine. This is my grape press that I've had for about 18 years now, and periodically have to fix it and repair it. And when you first start the press, you get free-run wine, and sometimes winemakers will separate the free-run from the pressed wine because the free-run will have less tannins in it. Once you start to press the grapes, as you're pressing it, that pressure pushes out some more of the tannins from the skins and from the seeds. Now, I always separate the free run from the pressed, but within 2 weeks, it's all mixed together. And so I've never gone to bottling with free run versus pressed wine. No, I mean, if you didn't add any protection with sulfite, yeah, theoretically it would, because tannins are protectors, yeah, of the wine. Yeah. Right? Tom Courtney did that, and I listened to his process, and I said, nope, I'm not going to do that. So I have not done that. But yes, go ahead. You can definitely do that and then report back on it. But it's a technique that is to get rid of those, maybe the harsher tannins in the seed. Yeah.
I pretty much routinely do that.
Yeah.
I've done that, I think, since 2015 with all of my reds.
And do you find it
I think it's softer.
softer tannins? Yeah.
I will do it for 2 to 5 days in a row.
Yeah. It's a very labor-intensive process.
It is.
Yeah.
Take the can off and I think the juice, I'll bring the juice out and let the can push it down and then you take the can off the top and take all the seeds out of the bottom.
It's a lot of work and very messy. You better have clothes that you never want to put on in any kind of public function. Yes, Charlie?
Well, it's a couple days into fermentation for sure. When you can see the seeds are really being released and they're dropping to the bottom of the fermentation vessel. And you can tell after a while, but the alcohol starts releasing that from the pulp. I do mine in about half about 10, 15, 24.
You do the pressing? Oh, okay, yeah. So there's a number of our winemakers that do it. You should probably have some of you guys write an article for the Vintners Press about that, because I don't think we've ever had anybody write about that. Tom talked about it a lot, but and just by him telling us, that was enough to convince me not to do it. Okay, so now once you press your wine, you've got this new wine. You've got it in carboys, and now there's the settlement of the lees. And what happens is that within 24 hours, you get what is called gross lees, Gross, gross lees. A whole bunch of the lees that come from the particles from the skins, and it falls to the bottom, and you've got to rack your new wine off that within 24 to 48 hours, or else you're potentially going to get this rotten egg smell, hydrogen sulfide, and that's not good for your wine. And so you want to rack off the gross lees. Then you're still going to have leaves that are falling down after that first racking process. Now, those leaves that are falling down are not called gross leaves anymore. They're called fine leaves. And those leaves are very good. They've got a lot of nutrients in it, vitamins in it, dead yeast in it. And what I do at this point is, over the next couple weeks, if not months, while it's still going through malolactic fermentation, or even after that, every 2 days, stir up the fine leaves, go up into the young wine, and then saturate the young wine with whatever they have in there. And that's supposed to be very good for the health of the wine and for bringing out added flavors in the wine. So I've been doing that probably for the past 10 years or so. After malolactic fermentation is complete, that's when you can add the potassium metabisulfite to protect the wine. Now, there's techniques you can use, measurement techniques, to see whether it's done. The technique I often use is I get a flashlight and I shine it through. I shine it through the wine at the top at the neck, and I just jiggle the carboy a little bit and see if there's any really fine bubbles coming up. If there are, I say, well, yes, it's probably not done yet. When I don't see those bubbles anymore, then I say, well, it's probably done, which is not a scientific technique, but that's what I use. I have tried measuring it, and I have done that, but to measure that is fairly expensive, and so I just have used this technique. I also put my red wine into oak barrels, and I've been doing this for years. My barrels have the malolactic bacteria in there as well, and so if it's not complete, it will be completed in the oak barrels over the next 1 to 3 years that it's in there. I use oak barrels for all my red wines now, and it's greatly improved the quality of, improved the quality of my red wines. All of my barrels are now neutral, meaning they don't impart any more oak flavor into the wine. And actually, I prefer that, because I want to get the full expression of the grape and not have the taste of the oak. And one thing that oak barrels do is that they engage in what is called microoxygenation. So the wine evaporates through the pores of the oak over the course of months in there, and it concentrates the flavor of the wine. Now, Jim? Yes, he's, the barrel broker, is still located there, and I did talk to him about a year ago. Yes, so he's still there. And you can buy used oak barrels from him. Some of them are spirit barrels, some of them are wine barrels. And they're anywhere from 5 gallons to the 65-gallon barrels. I use 20-gallon barrels, and I have one 15-gallon. It was a 15-gallon bourbon barrel that I did that one experiment with, maybe 10 years ago that the club was part of. That ended up in Winemaker magazine, where I was comparing using spirit barrels in red wine. Yeah, so you can get those from him. The Barrel Broker in Menominee Falls.
Yeah, and he's national. Did he come from California?
Yes, he came from Sacramento. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, let's put it out there.
Yeah, there's actually I wrote a winemaking article about him, 15 years ago. Okay, so now blending the wine. That's the last thing. With red wine, some wines have they're called donut holes. There's a hole in the profile of the wine. Cabernet Sauvignon has a hole in the mid palate that can be filled by Merlot. Adding a little bit, maybe 10% Merlot to a Cabernet Sauvignon will fill in, make it, the Merlot has fleshier tannins than Cabernet Sauvignon does. So often Cabernet Sauvignon has a little bit of Merlot in it. Now, when you buy it at the store, it won't say that because they don't have to tell you that if it's under, I think, 30% or 35%. With Petit Pearl, this is something that Mike Cesar's did first, and he came to a crush, and he said he added some Cabernet Sauvignon to his Petit Pearl, and I tasted it, and I thought, oh, this is what's missing from my Petit Pearl, and so he added a little bit of Cab, and that adds some complexity to Petit Pearl, which I think is lacking a little bit of tannins. Zinfandel, I grew up, this is the last thing I'll say, I grew up in the Upper Peninsula, and my grandfather made Zinfandel, and it was the first one I ever tasted, and I was only like 8 years old, but I loved it, and I always tried to make Zinfandel, when I started making wine, and it never tasted like my grandfather's, and I went to California, and I went to a winemaker out there, a commercial winemaker, and talked to him about this, and he said, your wine is like the wine we make here, and I tasted. He said, I said, yes, that's exactly like my wine, but I think it's missing something. He said, here's what it's missing. Most Zinfandel adds Syrah and maybe a little bit of Muscat to it. The Petite Syrah adds tannins and color, deeper color to the Zinfandel, and the Muscat, which is a white grape, adds a little bit of acid zinc to it. And so I did that, and all of a sudden, my grandfather was right there with me. And that's what was missing. So red wines can often be improved by blending a small amount. With the Zin, you can't go more than 15%, or you're going to